Rolling, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and introduce
So I
yourself.
should look right there at XD
Exactly.
Okay. My name is Eleanor Terry. I work at the High School of Telecommunications, Arts, and Technology in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. It's a public school. And this class you just saw was 10th, 11th, and maybe a couple 12th graders in Algebra 2 Trigonometry, which is a year-long course that ends in a Regents exam.
Okay. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before the lesson, and what will come after it?
So this was a lesson that would have happened, did happen in the middle of a unit. So they've learned everything about sine and cosine, special right triangles, unit circle. They've come into Algebra 2 trigonometry knowing how to graph on a coordinate plane. And so this activity was sort of putting all of those things together and synthesizing. There wasn't anything I explicitly taught during the lesson, but just maybe push their conceptual knowledge further, like what happens with a negative coefficient or with a vertical shift in the equation. Hoping to build on their prior knowledge to push them forward to those ideas without having to explicitly teach all of the variations in an equation in separate lessons.
Good. Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge?
The text, like the activity?
The text. I mean, is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence?
Yeah, so our math department works really closely together to design sequences of activities. This is what we would call a formative assessment lesson. And this was something that was designed by a coworker of mine last year to really come right before a summative assessment in the trigonometry unit.
Talk about the standards targeted in the lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
Well, while it did cover maybe two of the Common Core content standards around sine and cosine graphs and the impact that different numbers have on those equations, I think the focus was more on the mathematical practice standards of using precise language, persevering through problem solving, and having students model. That's not right. That's not even true. Can I look at?
Go for it.
I wrote this out. I cover two of the Common Core content standards involving the unit circle and using amplitude and frequency and period. I do believe that this kind of lesson really focuses in on the mathematical practice standards, where I really want my students to be using mathematical language precisely to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. There's sort of a low like if they made a match that someone else didn't agree with, it wasn't like, oh no, we already wrote it down, we handed it in. The cards are movable, and so they're able to, it pushes them to have a conversation about these cards are a match because, and if someone else disagrees with them and convinces them otherwise, then they can just switch the cards, no problem. So it's a sort of a group task that forces them to work as a group. I think when I first started learning about students working well the importance of students working in groups, I would design a worksheet like I always had, and then say work together in groups on this worksheet, and there would be a kind of like one kid who kind of did it and the other kids would copy it. This was maybe 6-7 years ago, but in the past 3 years, now that we have these mathematical practice standards, I really started to think about designing activities that foster that kind of student interaction, where those four students actually have to work together to make those pairs because another student is saying, hey, I don't agree with that, what about this? So that the activity is designed to support the students working together. I also, as I circulated, I try to push the students to use precise language, not to say it or period when they mean be or frequency, so that the students have a appropriate ownership of the precise language.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies?
There was something that I printed out about this one, the indicate core action 1. Is that what this one is? Yeah. Okay. I think that this lesson focuses on the idea that we are teaching depth and not, that we're teaching things deeply, and that the students have a full understanding of how equations change the visual, how the visual might change the way you write an equation, and not just, if you see this, this is the answer. If you see this, this is the answer. And to have that back and forth understanding. And so the structure of the lesson was for them to match the graphs and the equations, then look at the graph, write the equation, and then look at the equation and graph it. So they're learning the same concept from 3 different lenses, which would result in a really deep understanding of that concept rather than a linear progression of when you see a negative coefficient, this happens. And it's less information coming directly from me and more them working together to construct their own conceptual understanding.
Miss Mitchell, please dial 3463. Yeah. Miss Mitchell, 3463.
Okay. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I think what I used to do when I used to teach a class called Math B before there was Algebra 2 Trig, and I used to really think of my lessons as covering material. Like, I covered that. Okay, great. I covered amplitude and period. Great. And I have looked back on my lessons. Of course, they were like on transparencies, and it would be like, what impact does amplitude have on the graph? And I would just teach that and then be like, great, I covered it. They know it. It's their responsibility. I think now I think of teaching more in cycles. And so I try an approach of teaching something and then see how it goes. And then I, continuously are assessing their understanding of it. Each class is different. I have a 4th period and a 5th period of the same class, and different periods get through different material more quickly than others. So I think I approach teaching more as a research project now, where, what was the original question? I have no idea.
Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
So I think I now spend a lot more time outside of the classroom developing my lessons and spend a lot less time during the class speaking, whereas I used to not spend that much time planning and really just put a lot of energy into the delivery of the information during class. And I've seen a shift in what I think of as my role in the classroom more as a facilitator than as a deliverer of information. And I think that this lesson was exemplary of that, because most of the talking about mathematics happened from the students. And what I was doing was more trying to pinpoint where their sense making was, and if they were making sense to each other. And just more facilitating those conversations amongst them rather than being the deliverer of mathematics.
How did you support all students in working with grade level texts? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
A lot of the support happens with how I group the students. I think continuously within each unit, I figure out where the students are at and then try to make heterogeneous groups, so that students who are strong graphers will be with students who are good communicators, and so they push each other to push things that they are nervous about to become their strengths. I also have sort of a loose scaffolding agenda of what lessons are coming up, and so I can think of how I can best support them to do that. I wouldn't ever give this activity at the beginning of the unit because they needed a lot of prior knowledge in order to attack this kind of activity. So I was mindful of that, knowing that this lesson was coming up, to scaffold them to make sure that they were successful, but also had a productive struggle. So you don't want to give them something that's too, match. So it's kind of a game to play of like, what's the productive struggle without being too frustrating, I guess. So it's kind of a fine balance that sometimes I fall on either side of.
How do you know the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
I think that sometimes with teenagers you can tell if something's working by the amount of on-task behavior you have. I like to work on the assumption that the students all want to be learning, and if they are off task, it's somehow in the way I've set up the activity. Today there was film cameras and everything, so they were like probably more on task than usual, but you can get sort of a sense in the room of, are they continuing to work through and persevere through difficult problems. And then what I'll do is I'll sit down with the exit tickets and see and compare them to the pre-assessment I gave on Friday to see if there was any growth in their understanding, where the growth was the biggest, and then I'll plan my lessons from there. So I kind of got like a formative assessment by walking around writing down what the students were saying, listening in on conversations, and I'll have a more formal assessment through their written work that I collected at the end of the period.
Let's see. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson?
I think I've worked really hard to establish a classroom where students are talking to each other and explaining their reasoning. The students know that, E6 is not going to be a substantial answer to me, and I'm always going to ask them, how do you know, where did you get that, what details did you look at in order to make that match. So I think that at the beginning of the semester there was a lot of pushback. I would say, how did you get that answer? And they'll go, because I did, because I know the answer. And now it's become more of a classroom culture where they speak in full sentences from the beginning. And I even hear it when they're talking with each other. And it just, it's one of my main goals for them, is for them to be able to communicate about their thinking in a way that they can help push each other's thinking, rather than just because I see it, because you told me, because that's the answer. That we want to push the expectation that they can fully explain their thinking, just as they do in their history and English classes.
Reflecting on the lesson, what worked well and what might you do differently?
I think that the tactile cards works very well for the students. I think it works well for them to have, to be able to, if something seems too difficult, they can switch to another card, and so they can differentiate for themselves within the same lesson. Oftentimes when I give them a worksheet, they start with one. If they get frustrated with one, they're just like stuck on one for 15 minutes. This allowed them to kind of work around things that they struggled with and use the matches that they had to support their understanding. The plan was to get through the first two phases a little bit more quickly in order to have them get to phase 3, which was to take a equation and graph it. What will be interesting to see is if on their exit tickets, if there was a question like that, if they were able to use what we did earlier to extend to that kind of question, even though we didn't do it explicitly in class. I'll be interested to see if that works out. And if not, we'll do that tomorrow. But the conversation about the impact of a negative coefficient in front of the trigonometric function was so important at that moment that I spent more time doing that than I had intended, so that pushed back the other phase. But you have to go with what they're at right now and not try to push through the work to get to it just because you planned it that way. Yeah, because I do think that having that conversation about the negative cosine will help them have a better conceptual understanding of how coefficients impact the graphs.
Last question is,
Yeah.
were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
I think it's always interesting. Sometimes teachers talk about like, well, this kid is really bright, or this kid, but I find that different days of the week, different lessons, different students kind of come out of the woodwork. There were students who don't usually take a leadership role during group work activities who did today. So it just consistently reminds me to have students in mind who maybe aren't as vocal. There's a student in the back right corner, her name was Anna, who isn't necessarily the most vocal student, but she was able to ask really meaningful questions of her classmates to further her understanding, and this activity facilitated that. Whereas oftentimes in pair work or group work, she's more on the passive side of learning. Today's activity allowed her to kind of re-enter the conversation as a leader, because she's very good at organizing and knows what kind of questions lead to responses that help further her knowledge.
That's it. You're done?
Cool.
Good job.